All right, I want to begin this morning with a quiz. So I need everybody to take a pen out from behind your chairs there and grab your bulletin. You can write it on the back of your sermon notes or on your bulletin itself. It's just going to be A, B, or C. We have 12 questions. A, B, or C. Here's the topic, the world in which we live. How well do you know it? Everybody ready? All right, here we go. In all low-income countries across the world today, how many girls finish primary school? So again, we're not talking about the United States. We're talking about the world we live in. How many girls finish primary school? Second question, where does the majority of the world population live? Low-income countries, middle-income countries, or high-income countries? In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has almost doubled, remained more or less the same, almost halved. So globally over the last 20 years. What is the life expectancy of the world today? 50 years, 60 years, or 70 years? There are 2 billion children in the world today, aged 0 to 15 years old. How many children will there be in the year 2100, according to the United Nations? 4 billion, 3 billion, or 2 billion? The UN predicts that by 2100, the world population will have increased by another 4 billion people. What is the main reason? There will be more children, age below 15. There will be more adults, 15 to 74. Or there will be more very old people, age 75 plus. If you're here today and you're over 75, we don't consider you like very old. You're just hitting your peak spiritually, right? How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the last 100 years? More than doubled, remained about the same, decreased to less than half. Now think of natural disasters. There are roughly 7 billion people in the world today, which best reflects where they live. And the B stands for billion. So 1 billion Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, and 4 billion in Asia. Or 1 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 2 billion in Africa, and 3 billion in Asia. Or 2 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, 3 billion in Asia. Where's the dispersion of the world's population? How many of the world's 1-year-old children have been vaccinated against some diseases? 20%, 50%, 80%. Worldwide, 30-year-old men have spent 10 years in school on average. How many years have women of the same age spent in school? 9 years, 6 years, or 3 years? In 1996, tigers, giant pandas, and black rhinos were all listed as endangered. How many of these 3 species are more critically endangered today? 2 of them, 1 of them, or none of them? How many people in the world have some access to electricity? 20%, 50%, or 80%? All right. Got your answers? That was the world as we think it is. Now let's look at the world as it actually is. In all low-income countries across the world today, how many girls finish primary school? 60%. Where does the majority of the world population live? Middle-income countries. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has almost halved. One of the greatest achievements in human history is that stat right there. What is the life expectancy of the world today? 70 years. There are 2 billion children in the world, age 0 to 15. How many will there be in 2100 according to the UN? 2 billion. Same number. The UN predicts that by 2100 there'll be 4 billion more people. What category will those people be? Adults, 15 to 74. How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the past 100 years? Think of India, the tsunami, the earthquakes. It decreased to less than half. There are roughly 7 billion people in the world today, which best reflects where they live. 1 billion Americas, Europe, Africa, and then 4 billion in Asia. Just think of the populations in China and India. How many of the world's 1-year-old children have been vaccinated against some diseases? Well, this number is going down in America. 80%. 80% have been vaccinated. Worldwide, 30-year-old men have 10 years in school. On average, women of the same age have spent 9 years in school. In 1996, tigers, giant pandas, and black rhinos were all listed as endangered. Today, they're all doing well. How many people in the world have some access to electricity? 80%. How many of you thought the world was doing worse than what it actually is? Okay, you're not alone. Factfulness is a book by Hans Rosling. If you watch TED Talks, you may have seen him on a TED Talk, but he has spent his adult life as a professor, a doctor of world medicine, I guess would be the best way to describe it. He speaks to the United Nations. He speaks to big corporations, speaks all over the world, and his passion is to get the facts out there. Like, these are the facts, because if we know the facts, then we can continue doing something about it. If we don't know the facts, then we're going to be all wrong in what we're trying to do and what we're accomplishing. And so in 2017, he gave 12,000 people in 14 countries this exact quiz. Same 12 questions I just asked you. Average score was 2 out of 12. So if you got 3 or 4 or 5, pat yourself on the back, you're doing well. However, if you got 4 out of 12, just know that you got the same score as random bananas marked A, B, and C thrown to chimpanzees. So humans got worse than random. No one out of 12,000 people got 12 out of 12. One person got 11 out of 12, and she was from Sweden. And then 15 people got 0 correct. I had somebody first service come and tell me it's 17 now. Here was his saying. He couldn't understand why people were so, because a lot of these people that he was speaking to had the same statistics in front of them that he had. Why were they getting it wrong? And this is what he said. It wasn't because of news or fake news or negativity in the media. He said it was because we're hardwired to have an overly dramatic worldview. We tell ourselves stories, put together narratives, and we have a overly dramatic is the word he uses. And he says if your worldview is wrong, then you will systematically make wrong guesses. So you'll be worse than random because your worldview is wrong. You'll make wrong guesses. And then this is what caught my attention, this line here. He said, this data, as you have never known it is data therapy. It is understanding as a source of mental peace. Now we have a long way to go in getting the world. Those numbers we should be aiming at 100% for a lot of those numbers, and we're not there. But it's a lot better place than it is today than it was a generation ago. And what got me is that understanding as a source of mental peace. I think sometimes we forget the facts about God. And so we have this overly dramatic view of how things are playing out, not just in the world, but in our own personal lives. We forget the facts about who God is and what God has done. And so we get this negative perspective. And specifically, I think we start to think, is anything we're doing making a difference? Is anything we're doing accomplishing what we hoped it would accomplish, what God has maybe said it would accomplish? And because we don't have the right understanding, we don't have the facts about who God is square in our heads, and because we don't think about them, we have this warped worldview about the effects of our ministry and what God is able to accomplish through us. This is what we see in the story of Elijah today. Elijah, if you remember a few weeks ago before Easter, we were in 1 Kings 18, and it is one of the high points of ministry anywhere in the Old Testament. Elijah goes up to the top of Mount Carmel, challenges Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Remember, there's like 850 of them. And he says, we're going to have a showdown here, a duel in the OK Corral at Mount Carmel. And so he's got the 450 and the 400 prophets, the 850. They put their sacrifice on the altar, and they pray to Baal to come down and consume the sacrifice. Nothing happens. And Elijah puts it up there, gets it wet so everybody knows this can't be a fluke, and prays to Yahweh that he would consume the sacrifice, and God does. He consumes it right there. All these people who were on the fence, all these people of Israel who had really no conviction whether Yahweh was God or whether Baal was God, and then all of a sudden they have conviction now. So much conviction that Elijah tells them to go wipe out the false prophets, and they go wipe out the false prophets. This is a turning point in the history of Israel, or so Elijah thought. So much so that Elijah runs ahead of King Ahab and leads him back into the city, sort of a victory march, like things are going to turn around in Israel now. And they get into the city, and Ahab tells Jezebel, his wife, what has just happened. And her response evokes something in Elijah that we wouldn't expect. Somebody who just experienced that victory, who saw what God did, and it couldn't be attributed to anything other than God's doing. And he gets threatened by the queen, and this is how he reacts. Open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 19, and let's take a look. 1 Kings chapter 19 is on page 301, and the Bible's under your chairs. 1 Kings chapter 19, we'll pick it up in verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." That's kind of paradox what's happening here, right? He runs from Jezebel because he doesn't want to die. He gets a little past Beersheba and says, "Lord, kill me." It's like, well, if you just stayed back in the town, Jezebel would have taken care of it for you. What are you doing now? But he runs, and there's some significance about to where he's running. Beersheba was at the sort of the southern end of Judah, right before you went into the Negev, the desert region leading further south. And there's some significant moments in Israel's history that happened in Beersheba. One of them is with Isaac. Remember, Abraham had a son, Isaac. Isaac is traveling south through the promised land, and as he's traveling south, he hits some of the stops that his father made and had built wells, and every time Isaac goes to a well and tries to settle there, some locals come and threaten him, and he has to up and leave. And it's like, God promised me this land, and yet every time I stop to try and settle, these other people come and they bully us, and we have to keep moving on until finally he comes to Beersheba, and this is what God tells him. From there, he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake." So Beersheba was a place where God had come to the patriarchs, come to significant people in God's history, and sort of reminded them, I'm Yahweh, I'm God, and I'll take care of this. Fear not. He did the same thing at the end of Genesis. When Jacob, whose name is now changed to Israel, is heading south with his family, south out of Israel into Egypt, and he's wondering, Lord, should we leave the promised land to go down to Egypt? And this is what God says. So Israel came to Beersheba, and God said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again." Beersheba is a significant place. But what Elijah does in Beersheba is a little different. He comes to Beersheba, and it says he dropped off his servant, and then he continued on. The act of dropping off his servant was, in essence, throwing up his hands, throwing in the towel, and saying, "I'm done being a prophet. I don't need the servant anymore. Lord, I'm out." And so he goes into the wilderness, and he sits down. He prays to the Lord, "Lord, just take me. Just kill me." And what he says there, he says, "I am no better than my fathers." What's happened is Elijah has become discouraged. Elijah had just had this great victory on Mount Carmel. All of the people of Israel gathered on Mount Carmel, saw this victory of Yahweh. He goes down into the city, leading the king, thinking this is going to be a processional and a turning point in Israel's history. And what happens? Nothing. Israel doesn't change. Jezebel's just going to kill him now, and he's like, "I'm a failure as a prophet. Lord, I thought what I was doing was making a difference. I thought the ministry, the prophetic ministry you had given me, was going to change things in Israel, but here I stand and nothing's changed. I'm no better than Moses. When he came out with the first generation of Israelites, and Moses was fed up with the people, wanted the people to change, and Moses couldn't change the hearts of that first generation of Israelites. I'm no better than Samuel. Samuel is in the promised land. He's a great prophet of the people, and they reject Yahweh as king. And Samuel can't believe it. You guys are making such a mistake. You need Yahweh. You need God as your king. You do not want to forsake him. And Samuel can't change their mind. Over and over again in Israel's history, we see prophets who had this prophetic ministry that God had given them, this prophetic ministry not to tell the future, but a prophetic ministry to warn the people so that their hearts would be turned back to Yahweh, and nothing happens. And Elijah says, what I'm doing isn't making a difference. Lord, I'm done. Just take my life. My ministry's over. Now, I don't think many of us come to the point that Elijah does. We're like, Lord, just kill me. But I do think a lot of us get discouraged. And we fall into the trap of thinking what we're doing isn't making a difference. If you're here this morning and you've been involved with ministry at all, Christian ministry, I'm sure you've had those moments where you think, is anything I'm doing making a difference? You struggle in a Sunday school class to hold kids' attention. You struggle in Sunday school class not to punch little kids. You have all of these, and you leave on Sunday and you go, is anything I'm doing making a difference? Or you work with the youth group. You work with the high schoolers or the junior highers, and you have that same sort of a mentality. It's funny when pastors get together, one of the things that I find us often talking about is our handyman repairs. And it's not because we're good at it. But here's what it is. I'll spend 12 hours changing out a faucet. It takes a plumber about 45 minutes. But I change out that faucet, and at the end of the day, I can see the difference. Like, I've got a new faucet, and it works. As a pastor, I give advice all the time, and it doesn't seem to make a bit of difference in people's lives. And it gets discouraging. You're like, Lord, is what I'm doing making a difference? Sometimes those conversations are hard. Like, I don't want to tell somebody. Ask any of our elders. It's hard to correct people. It's hard to confront people. And you wonder, is it making a difference at all? And it's easy to get discouraged and think, no, so Lord, I'm done. Or maybe not so much Christian ministry in the local church, but maybe it's ministry in your family. Parents, you continuously talk to your children about the Lord, whether they're 9 or 19 or 29 or 40. And you want nothing more than for them to see the salvation that Christ offers, the abundant life that Christ offers, the wonderful implications of the gospel in every area of our life, and you talk to them. And it doesn't make a difference. And so you kind of throw up your hands like, I'm just going to quit talking about it. It's just easier not to talk about it. Or maybe it's that situation at work where you have a friend, or maybe it's a family member, an employee, whoever it is, but you just constantly are trying to bring up the gospel message. You're talking about, they come to you and talk about how guilty they're feeling. And you're like, no, that's what the gospel's about. Jesus offers forgiveness, and you think you got them on the hook. And no, it doesn't make a difference. And it's easy to just start seeing the world, having the world view that our ministry doesn't matter. Lord, I'm out. And we forget the facts about God. We forget that God has made a promise that whatever we do in the Lord is not in vain. That's Paul's conclusion in his longest summary of the gospel. He ends his sermon about the gospel by saying, therefore be steadfast and immovable, because whatever you do in the Lord is not in vain. And so when we get to that place where we just feel like it's not making a difference, we remember this story and remember what God does for Elijah. God reminds him of his covenant promises. And that's what the second part of this story is about. If you pick it up in verse 5. And Elijah lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked, and behold, there was at his cake baked, and on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time, and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Mount Horeb was a place where God met with somebody else, a prophet by the name of Moses. Maybe you know it better as Mount Sinai. That was where God not only met with Moses, but when Moses comes back with all the people, he meets with them again and gives them the law. And so what is God doing? He's taking Elijah down to a very significant place that reminds him of the covenant promises that God has made. And when Elijah gets to Horeb, this place of that covenant, God meets him again. Verse 9. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. He's seeing the world through a faulty worldview. Lord, I'm the only one left, and I didn't make a difference. Nothing I said ultimately mattered. Verse 11, and he said, Go out and stand in the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. Everything that happened with Moses and the people of Israel at Horeb is now happening with Elijah. Remember why the people were scared when they stood at the base of Mount Sinai? Because the earth shook. Because the lightning came. Because the clouds were there. It's like God is reminding Elijah, the covenant I made here with Moses is the covenant I am going to keep forever. I made a promise, and I am a promise keeper. And out of the noise and the reminders of how small we are and how much a covenant keeper God is, he comes to Elijah with a word. And he tells Elijah, there's a reminder. Elijah, I have a ministry for you that I've called you to, and you need to carry out that ministry. You see this, pick it up in verse 14. Or actually, verse 13. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he repeats the same thing. He said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. Go back where you came from, Elijah. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elijah, the son of Shaphat, Abel-Mahalah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Elisha, I'm not done with you. You have a ministry that I've called you to, and you feel like it's not making a difference, and it can't make a difference, but I want you to know it's going to make a difference. You're going to go back up, and first thing you're going to do is you're going to anoint the king of Syria. Now, why Syria? That's not Israel. That's not God's people. Because Elijah, I am not just king of Israel. I am Lord of hosts. I am Lord over the earth, and even the king of Syria is somebody under my direction. So you go anoint that king and remind yourself of who I am. Learn the facts about me. And then you're going to go into Israel, and you're going to anoint Jehu. And guess what? As dark as you think it is in the northern kingdom, Jehu's going to come, and he's going to continue what you did by wiping out a bunch of the prophets of Baal. So you go do that. And then you go anoint your successor, because your ministry is going to continue even after you're gone. And you're going to have the privilege of putting the cloak on the man who's going to take over the ministry. Elijah, you have a ministry I've called you to. And I've made a promise that it will continue. And Elijah, you may not see everything you want to see, but what you're doing is making a difference. Elijah, you're a link in a chain that stretches from the beginning of my covenant promises to the fulfillment of my covenant promises. You just worry about being that link. For you, that link is going and proclaiming the covenant faithfulness and what that looks like to Israel and appointing kings and appointing a successor. Elijah, don't be discouraged. Remember who I am and the promises I've made. It's the same thing with us. When we get discouraged, we need to remember the promises that God has made, the covenant faithfulness that God will continue to carry out, and remember that we're just a link in the chain. Sometimes we may see the effects of our ministry, sometimes we may not see the effects of our ministry. But it's not in vain, because God has made a promise to use and redeem everything we do for him. When I was, most of you know, I grew up in a great Christian household, but I wasn't like real concerned with Christ. He wasn't I had other idols in my life. And as a junior in college, God really got a hold of me. That's when his word started really coming alive to me. And through my junior year and senior year of college, I was working at a country club. And while I was working at the country club, I would always, like a lot of people who are either new believers or the Bible's coming alive, you want to tell people about this. And so I was in the bag room and the cart barn, which is downstairs, the dirty job. But I would have to go upstairs and I would hang out and talk to the pros in the pro shop. And they were older guys, probably. So if I'm, 20, 21 at the time, they're like in their early 30s, and one of them was in his early 40s. And I used to tell them, try and convince them that the gospel is true, that Jesus was who he said he is, and what kind of a difference he could make. And they'd give me a hard time, and they would ask me hard questions that I didn't know the answer to, but I'd be like, I'm going to get back to you on that. And then I'd go try and find the answer, and then I'd come back. And so for those last 2 years of college, and then my first year of seminary, I switched jobs at that point, became a teacher. But so there's about 3 or 4 years there where I was just trying to read, and it wasn't making a bit of difference in these guys' lives, or so I thought. Well, fast forward about 4 or 5 years later, I was pastoring at OCF, and Courtney and I, this is back when we actually had a home line. You guys remember those? And there was this phone next to my bed, matching that. And it rings. It's Saturday morning, and I'm still in bed, and the phone rings, and I pick it up. I'm like, hello. He goes, hey, Brandon. I'm like, yeah. He goes, this is Ron. I'm thinking, Ron. He goes, Ron from Old Ranch. I'm like, oh, Ron. Gosh, Ron, how are you? He was the guy that was in his early 40s. And Ron says, hey, I thought I just needed to tell you, I wanted to let you know that I'm leading the men's ministry at my church. And I thought, wow. I didn't think he listened to a word I said that whole time, but he wanted to call and thank me because he was saved through some of those seeds that I had planted over those years. Fast forward probably 20 years later, this was just a couple years ago, that the other guy, who was in his early 30s at the time, died of a massive heart attack real suddenly, very young. And his wife, I hadn't talked to them since I worked at Old Ranch, but his wife went out of her way to call me and to tell me what a difference it made in me talking to him about the gospel, which eventually took hold in his life. It's like, that's awesome. And I didn't think it made a difference. Believe me, there was a lot of days where they would ask me questions and I didn't want to answer them because I just felt like I was going to get embarrassed and it wasn't going to make a difference. But that's the way God works. I'm sure some of you who have been in ministry faithfully for a lot of years, God has given you those encouraging reminders that what you're doing is making a difference. But even if you don't hear the encouraging reminders, you know who God is. The fact about who God is and what his character is like, and over again in Scripture, we see him making good on the promises. No matter what the threats are that come, no matter if a queen is after you and a queen is going to kill you, Elijah, I've made a promise. I've got something for you to do, and you're going to accomplish it. And the chapter ends with an encouragement that he is picking his successor. And we'll read about the other ones in later chapters. But in verse 19, Elijah departs from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him. And he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. Elijah, I got something for you to do. And I know you don't feel like it's making a difference, but it is. And you may not see all the results that you want to see, but know that it's making a difference. And here's a little bit of encouragement. Go pick your successor. You're going to know who's going to carry on your ministry. It's not going to end with you. It's going to continue. That's the character of God. That's the fact about God. God is accomplishing his plans. And he's invited us to be links in that chain. Every single one of you in here, every single one of us has a part to play in that. And if we will faithfully do what God has called us to do, we can be sure that it's not in vain and it will accomplish what he wants. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you